While I was giving birth to our son, my husband was signing divorce papers and taking everything we owned. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know he had already emptied our savings account. I didn't know he had transferred our car. I didn't know he had hidden documents, moved money, and planned every single step while I was too pregnant to notice. All I knew was that I was lying in a hospital bed, gripping the sheets, waiting for the man I loved to walk through the door. But Ethan never came. Not when the contractions got worse. Not when the nurse asked me if she should call someone. Not when our son took his first breath. And not when I held that tiny baby against my chest and whispered, "Your daddy will be here soon." I was wrong. He was never coming. 2 weeks earlier, I still thought I had a happy marriage. My name is Ava. I was 35 years old, 8 months pregnant, and working as a nurse at a small hospital just outside the city. I wasn't rich. I wasn't special. I was just a woman trying to build a normal life with the man I believed loved me. Ethan and I had been married for 6 years. We had a small house with a leaky kitchen faucet, a used car we were still paying off, and a nursery painted in soft blue because Ethan said our son should wake up surrounded by the color of the sky. At least, that was what he said. Back then, I believed every word. On Sunday mornings, he would make pancakes while I sat at the table with swollen feet, and a cup of tea I always forgot to drink. He would laugh when the baby kicked. He would put his hand on my stomach and say, "He's strong." And I would smile because I thought we were happy. I thought we were safe. I thought the hardest part of my life would be learning how to become a mother. I had no idea the real pain was already waiting for me. The nursery was almost finished. There was a crib by the window. A small white dresser. A rocking chair I bought secondhand and cleaned until it looked new. On the wall, Ethan had hung tiny wooden letters spelling the name we had chosen together. Noah. I remember standing in that room one night, folding baby clothes that smelled like detergent in hope. Ethan stood behind me with his arms around my waist. He kissed the side of my head and said, "Everything is going to be perfect." That sentence would come back to me later. Not because it was sweet, but because it was a lie. At the time, I didn't see it. I didn't see the way he stopped looking me in the eyes. I didn't see the way he kept his phone face down. I didn't see the way he started taking calls in the garage. I told myself he was stressed. His company had been going through changes. A new regional director had just arrived. A woman named Claire Whitman. Ethan mentioned her a lot. At first, casually. Then constantly. Claire wanted this. Claire said that. Claire had a new strategy. Claire was impossible to impress. Claire needed him to stay late again. I didn't like how often I heard her name. But I was tired. Pregnancy had made everything heavier. My body. My thoughts. My fear. So when Ethan came home late, I told myself he was working hard for us. When he missed dinner, I told myself he was trying to provide for our baby. When he forgot one of my doctor appointments, I told myself he was under pressure. That was my first mistake. I kept explaining away the things that hurt me. Because I wanted my family to survive. And because I still believed Ethan wanted the same thing. But looking back now, the signs were everywhere. The late nights. The locked phone. The sudden passwords. The missing bank statements. The way he would smile at me in the nursery, then turn cold the moment he stepped into the hallway. I just didn't know what those signs meant yet. I thought my husband was drifting away. I didn't know he was already gone. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment something inside me started to feel wrong. At the time, I ignored it. Like most wives do when they desperately want to believe everything is okay. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I had a prenatal appointment scheduled for 3 o'clock. Ethan promised he would meet me there. He had been to almost every appointment before that. Not all of them. But enough that I never imagined he would stop showing up. I arrived 20 minutes early. The waiting room was crowded with pregnant women and nervous husbands. Some were holding hands. Some were arguing about baby names. One man was carrying 3 bags because his wife refused to carry anything. I remember smiling at them. Then checking my phone. No message. No call. Nothing from Ethan. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Finally, I texted him. Everything okay? No answer. The nurse eventually called my name. I walked into the examination room alone. Again. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Adults miss appointments. People get busy. Life happens. But when I got back to my car afterward, I noticed he had finally texted me. Only 4 words. Sorry. Got held up. That was it. No explanation. No question about the baby. No apology beyond those 4 words. For some reason, that message bothered me more than it should have. Maybe because it felt cold. Maybe because it felt like I was talking to a coworker instead of my husband. Or maybe because deep down, I already knew something was changing. That evening, Ethan came home almost 2 hours later than usual. He looked tired. Or at least he wanted me to think he looked tired. I asked how work was. He shrugged. Busy. That was all. Busy. One word. End of conversation. The old Ethan would have talked for 20 minutes. The old Ethan loved telling stories. The old Ethan couldn't wait to share every detail of his day. This version of Ethan barely looked up from his phone. I watched him from across the dinner table. For a moment, I almost asked if everything was okay. I almost asked if he still loved me. I almost asked if there was someone else. But I didn't. Because I was scared of the answer. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night. The bed beside me was empty. At first I thought Ethan was in the bathroom. Then I noticed light coming from underneath the garage door. I walked downstairs. Slowly. Carefully. My back hurt. My feet were swollen. I was 8 months pregnant and exhausted. When I reached the garage, I heard Ethan talking. His voice was low. Almost a whisper. I couldn't hear the words. Only the tone. Soft. Careful. Intimate. When I opened the door, he immediately ended the call. Too quickly. Far too quickly. His expression changed the second he saw me. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah. Who were you talking to? Work. The answer came instantly. Too instantly. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket. I remember staring at him. Waiting for him to say more. He didn't. A strange silence settled between us. One I couldn't explain. Eventually I went back upstairs. But I didn't fall asleep. I just lay there in the dark. Listening. Thinking. Wondering. The next morning, Ethan acted completely normal. He kissed my forehead before work. Asked if I needed anything from the store. Even reminded me to drink more water. The contrast was confusing. One moment he felt distant. The next moment he felt like my husband again. And that's what made it so easy to doubt myself. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe pregnancy hormones were making me emotional. Maybe I was imagining problems that didn't exist. That's what I kept telling myself. Until the baby shower. A week before my due date, my sister organized a small baby shower at our house. Nothing fancy. Just family. A few friends. Cupcakes. Decorations. Gift bags. The kind of afternoon that should have felt perfect. Ethan smiled in every photograph. He wrapped an arm around me. He laughed with my family. He talked about Noah like he was the most excited father in the world. At one point, he even placed both hands on my stomach and said, "I can't wait to meet my son." Everyone smiled. My mother cried. I almost cried too. Because I thought I was looking at a man who loved his family. Now when I look at those photos, all I can think about is one thing. By then, he had already made his decision. By then, he already knew he was leaving. By then, he was already planning a future without me. And somehow, he still stood there smiling for the camera. My due date was still a few days away when the contractions started. At first, I thought they were false alarms. The kind every pregnant woman worries about during the final weeks. I tried to ignore them. I made breakfast, folded laundry, straightened the nursery. But by noon, I knew something was different. The pain was getting stronger, closer together, more consistent. I checked the clock. Then I called Ethan. No answer. That wasn't unusual. He was probably in a meeting. At least, that's what I told myself. So I left a voicemail. Hey, I think this might be it. Call me when you can. I remember smiling when I said it. I was nervous, excited, terrified, but mostly excited. After all, this was the day we had been waiting for. Our son was finally coming. An hour later, the contractions were much worse. I called again. Still no answer. Then again. And again. And again. Nothing. No call back. No text. No explanation. Just silence. By the time I made the decision to drive myself to the hospital, I had called him 11 times. I remember sitting in my car gripping the steering wheel while another contraction hit. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just sat there waiting for the pain to pass. Then I started the engine and drove myself to the hospital. Alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years taking care of patients in that building. Now I was arriving as one. When I reached the maternity ward, a nurse helped me through the doors. She asked where my husband was. I forced a smile. He's on his way. It was the first lie I told that day. The labor lasted nearly 14 hours. 14 hours of pain, fear, exhaustion, and waiting. Waiting for Ethan to walk through the door. Every time footsteps approached the room, I looked up. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. Every single time, it wasn't him. As the hours passed, my excitement slowly turned into confusion. Then worry. Then anger. I kept asking myself the same question. Where was he? Eventually, one of the nurses asked if there was anyone else she should call. My mother had passed away years earlier. My father lived in another state. My sister was overseas for work. There was no one. Just me. And the child I was trying to bring into the world. Late that night, Noah was born. The moment they placed him in my arms, everything else disappeared. The fear. The pain. The loneliness. For a few minutes, none of it mattered. He was perfect. Tiny fingers. Tiny nose. Tiny breaths. I stared at him and cried. Not because I was sad. Because I loved him instantly. More than I thought possible. I remember whispering. Your daddy is going to love you. Looking back now, that sentence breaks my heart. Because I believed it. I truly believed it. The next morning, Ethan still hadn't called. Not once. Not a single message. Not a single explanation. Nothing. 24 hours after our son was born, my phone finally rang. Ethan. I answered immediately. Relief flooded through me. For one stupid second, I thought maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe he had been hurt. Maybe there was some explanation that would make everything make sense. Where have you been? I asked. There was silence. Then his voice. Cold. Distant. Almost emotionless. Ava. I think we should separate for a while. I didn't understand what he was saying. Not at first. I looked down at our newborn son sleeping beside me. Then back at the hospital wall. Certain I had heard him wrong. What? Another pause. Then he said it again. Slowly. Clearly. Like someone reading from a script. I think our marriage isn't working anymore. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not because I thought marriages never failed. Not because I thought divorce was impossible. But because our son had been born 24 hours earlier. 24 hours. That was all. He didn't ask about Noah. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if the birth had gone smoothly. He didn't ask for a picture. He didn't even say congratulations. The first thing my husband said after missing the birth of our child was that he wanted out. I sat there speechless. Trying to process the words. Trying to understand how my life had changed so completely in less than a day. Then Ethan said something I'll never forget. I'll have my lawyer contact you. Not, let's talk. Not, I'm sorry. Not, can we work this out? A lawyer. As if I were a problem to be managed. A contract to be terminated. A mistake to erase. Before I could say anything else, he hung up. Just like that. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That was all it took for the future. I thought I had to disappear. At the time, I thought that phone call was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. The worst was still waiting. And I was about to discover just how much Ethan had taken before he walked away. 3 days later, Noah and I were discharged from the hospital. I should have been excited. Most new mothers dream about bringing their baby home. Introducing them to their nursery. Laying them down in their crib for the first time. Starting their new life together. Instead, I felt sick. Not physically. Emotionally. I still couldn't stop thinking about that phone call. The way Ethan had sounded. Cold. Detached. Like he had already erased me from his life. During those 3 days in the hospital, I called him more times than I want to admit. Every call went to voicemail. Every text went unanswered. I even sent him a picture of Noah. His first picture. Wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. Eyes closed. Tiny hand curled into a fist. I stared at that photo for a long time before sending it. Part of me believed it would change something. Part of me believed Ethan would see his son and remember who he was. He never replied. Not a single word. By the time I loaded Noah into the car seat, I knew I was going home alone. I just didn't realize how alone. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed to last forever. Every bump in the road made Noah stir. I kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Making sure he was breathing. Making sure he was okay. Because at that moment, he was the only thing in my life that still felt real. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment. The house looked exactly the same. The lawn needed mowing. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. The porch light was still broken. Nothing looked different. And maybe that's why I wasn't prepared for what waited inside. I carried Noah to the front door. Unlocked it. Stepped inside. At first, everything seemed normal. The living room was quiet. The kitchen looked untouched. No sign of Ethan. But that wasn't unusual. I figured he was avoiding me. Cowardly. But not surprising. Then I walked into our bedroom. And stopped. For a second, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Something felt wrong. Something was missing. Then I saw it. Half of Ethan's closet was empty. The shirts he wore to work were gone. His jackets were gone. His shoes were gone. The suitcase he used for business trips was gone. The empty space hit me harder than I expected. Because empty space doesn't lie. A phone call can be explained. A text can be misunderstood. A fight can be repaired. But an empty closet? That means someone has already made a decision. I stood there staring at those empty hangers. Trying to convince myself there was another explanation. Maybe he was staying somewhere temporarily. Maybe he just needed space. Maybe. Even then, I was still making excuses for him. I don't know why. Maybe because accepting the truth felt impossible. Or maybe because I had just given birth and my heart wasn't ready for another loss. Then Noah started crying. The sound snapped me back to reality. I picked him up, held him against my shoulder, and slowly walked through the rest of the house. That's when I noticed more things. Small things at first. Things that were easy to miss. The laptop Ethan used every night was gone. The drawer where we kept important documents was partially empty. A folder that used to contain insurance papers had disappeared. A lockbox we kept in the closet was gone. None of it made sense. Not yet. At the time, I assumed he had taken personal belongings. Nothing more. Nothing sinister. Nothing planned. I still thought this was a marriage falling apart. I didn't realize it was something much worse. Standing in the middle of that bedroom, holding my newborn son, I felt a fear I had never experienced before. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Fear. Because for the first time, I understood something. Ethan wasn't taking a break. He wasn't cooling off. He wasn't coming back tomorrow. Or next week. Or next month. He had left. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. For the next few hours, I tried to focus on Noah. I unpacked the hospital bag, changed his diaper, fed him, rocked him to sleep. I kept telling myself that I would deal with Ethan later. One problem at a time. That's what nurses do. That's what mothers do. We survive the crisis in front of us first. Then we deal with everything else. At least that was the plan. That evening, after Noah finally fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. I remember staring at my phone, debating whether I should call Ethan again. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me was terrified of what those answers might be. Instead, I decided to check our finances. I wasn't even worried yet. Not really. I just wanted to know where I stood. The hospital bills would be arriving soon. There would be diapers, formula, utilities, the mortgage. I needed to make a plan. So I opened the banking app. And for a moment, I thought I was looking at the wrong account. I blinked, closed the app, opened it again. The number didn't change. I stared at the screen, then stared some more, trying to understand what I was seeing. Most of our savings were gone. Not reduced. Not lower than usual. Gone. The account that had taken years to build was nearly empty. I felt my stomach drop. At first, I assumed there had to be some explanation. Maybe Ethan had moved the money. Maybe there was another account. Maybe there was some investment I didn't know about. I desperately wanted there to be a reasonable answer. But the transaction history told a different story. Transfer. 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 Withdrawal. Transfer. One after another. Some were recent. Some were weeks old. And suddenly, all those missing bank statements started making sense. My hands were shaking. I immediately called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. I left a message. Then another. Then another. The first one was calm. The second one was worried. By the third, I was crying. Not because of the money. Not entirely. Because every unanswered call felt like confirmation. He knew. He knew exactly what he had done. And he was hiding from me. That night I barely slept. Every time Noah woke up crying, I got up. Fed him. Changed him. Rocked him. Then sat back down at the kitchen table. Looking at those transactions. Looking for something that made sense. Nothing did. The next morning, things got worse. I opened my email and saw a message from a law office. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I saw Ethan's name. My chest tightened. I opened it. Attached were legal documents. Official documents. Prepared days earlier. Not after Noah was born. Not after our argument. Not after his phone call. Before. Much earlier. The divorce papers had already been prepared. Everything had already been arranged. The timing hit me harder than the papers themselves. While I was packing a hospital bag, he was preparing divorce documents. While I was washing baby clothes, he was meeting with lawyers. While I was counting down the days until our son arrived, he was counting down the days until he could leave. That realization broke something inside me. Because it meant the phone call wasn't a sudden decision. It wasn't an emotional reaction. It wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. A plan he had been working on while looking me in the eye every day. A plan he had hidden behind smiles, baby names, and promises about our future. I sat there reading those documents over and over, trying to understand how the man I married had become someone I no longer recognized. Then I saw the date. The papers had been prepared nearly 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. 3 weeks before our son was born. 3 weeks before I drove myself to the hospital. 3 weeks before I spent 14 hours waiting for him. I closed my eyes. And for the first time since Noah was born, I felt something stronger than sadness. Stronger than fear. Anger. Real anger. But I still had no idea how much worse things were about to get. I wish I could tell you that after discovering the missing money and the divorce papers, things finally stopped getting worse. They didn't. That was only the beginning. The first bill arrived 4 days later. It was from the hospital. I remember standing in the kitchen holding Noah in one arm and the envelope in the other. For a moment, I just stared at it, as if refusing to open it could somehow make it disappear. Eventually, I sat down and tore it open. The amount wasn't impossible. But it wasn't small either. Under normal circumstances, we could have handled it. A few months earlier, I wouldn't have panicked. But now almost all of our savings were gone. Every dollar mattered. I folded the bill and placed it on the counter. Then another envelope arrived. And another. Utilities. Insurance. Mortgage payments. Medical expenses. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. Every morning seemed to bring a new reminder that my life was falling apart. And the bills didn't care that I had just given birth. They didn't care that my husband had abandoned me. They didn't care that I was barely sleeping. They just kept coming. One after another. Like waves crashing against a house that was already breaking apart. At first, I tried to stay optimistic. I made lists. Budgets. Calculations. Plans. I told myself that if I was careful enough, disciplined enough, maybe I could hold everything together. Then reality arrived. Noah rarely slept for more than a couple of hours at a time. Some nights he woke up every 45 minutes. Sometimes he cried because he was hungry. Sometimes because he was uncomfortable. Sometimes for reasons I couldn't understand. I would feed him. Burp him. Rock him. Walk circles around the living room. Then finally get him back to sleep. Only to hear him crying again 20 minutes later. The exhaustion became overwhelming. I stopped knowing what day it was. I stopped knowing whether it was morning or night. Everything blurred together. Feedings. Diapers. Laundry. Bills. Fear. One night, around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the nursery crying quietly while Noah slept in my arms. Not because of him. Never because of him. Because I was exhausted. Because I was scared. Because I had no idea how I was supposed to do all of this alone. I remember looking around the room Ethan had helped decorate. The crib. The dresser. The rocking chair. Everything felt like a cruel joke. Just weeks earlier, this room had represented our future. Now it felt like a monument to everything I had lost. As if that wasn't enough, the mortgage payment was approaching. I spent hours staring at numbers, moving money from one account to another, trying to figure out which bills could wait, which bills couldn't, how much formula I could buy, how long I could survive. The math never worked. No matter how many times I checked. The math never worked. And then came the email. I almost didn't open it. I was sitting on the couch with Noah sleeping against my chest when the notification appeared on my phone. It was from the hospital where I worked. At first, I assumed it was routine paperwork. Maybe something related to maternity leave. Maybe an update from human resources. Instead, it was something else entirely. Something that made my hands go cold. I read the first paragraph twice. Then a third time. Because my brain refused to accept what it was seeing. Due to restructuring and budget reductions, my position had been eliminated. I kept reading, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. The hospital was cutting staff. And while I was on maternity leave, my role had been removed. Just like that. The job I had worked for years to build was gone. I lowered the phone slowly and looked down at Noah sleeping peacefully on my chest. At that moment, the full weight of my situation finally hit me. I had a newborn baby. No husband. Almost no savings. Mounting bills. And now, no job. For several minutes, I simply sat there in silence. Too shocked to cry. Too exhausted to panic. Just staring at the wall. Trying to imagine what I was supposed to do next. And for the first time since Ethan left, I genuinely didn't have an answer. A few days after losing my job, another envelope arrived. By then, I had started to hate envelopes. Every time I saw one in the mailbox, my stomach tightened. Because nothing good ever arrived anymore. Only bills. Warnings. Bad news. This envelope was different. The words were printed in red. I stood in the kitchen staring at it for almost a full minute before opening it. A part of me already knew what it would say. I just wasn't ready to read it. When I finally unfolded the letter, my hands began to shake. The mortgage payment was overdue. The grace period had expired. If payment wasn't received soon, further action would begin. The language was professional. Polite. Cold. The kind of language that destroys lives without raising its voice. I read the letter 3 times. Then I looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where Ethan and I used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings. The same kitchen where we argued about paint colors for the nursery. The same kitchen where we celebrated when we found out we were having a boy. For years, this house had been home. Now it felt like a countdown clock. I walked into Noah's room and sat in the rocking chair. He was asleep. Peaceful. Completely unaware of any of it. I envied him. For a few minutes, I simply watched him breathe. Then I started crying. Quietly. Carefully. The way exhausted mothers cry when they don't want to wake their children. I wasn't crying because of the house. Not entirely. I was crying because every part of my future felt uncertain. A month earlier, I had a husband. A job. A savings account. A plan. Now I had none of those things. I only had Noah. And suddenly, that felt terrifying. That afternoon, I called the mortgage company. I spent nearly an hour on hold. When someone finally answered, I explained everything. My husband had left. I had just given birth. I had lost my job. I was trying. I was doing everything I could. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic. But sympathy didn't change the numbers. When the call ended, I still owed money I didn't have. The next few days became a blur of calculations. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a calculator. Over and over. Trying to find a solution. trying to create money that simply wasn't there. Every version ended the same way. Not enough. Not enough for the mortgage. Not enough for the bills. Not enough for Noah. At night, I would lie awake listening to every sound in the house. The creaking floors. The refrigerator humming. The wind outside. And I would wonder how much longer we had left there. I hated that thought. Not for me. For Noah. Because every child deserves a home. A safe place. A stable place. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I could provide one. One evening, I found myself standing in the nursery doorway. Looking at the crib. The dresser. The little blue blankets folded neatly on the shelf. And a question entered my mind that terrified me. What if we lose this house? What if I can't protect him? What if I fail? I had survived Ethan leaving. I had survived losing the money. I had survived losing my job. But the possibility of losing our home felt different. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my son. And that fear was stronger than anything Ethan had done. A few days later, another call came. This time, the message was clear. Time was running out. When I hung up the phone, I looked around the living room. At the furniture. The television. The decorations. The wedding gifts we had collected over the years. And for the first time, a terrible thought crossed my mind. Maybe I would have to start selling things. Maybe pieces of my old life were the only thing keeping a roof over our heads. I didn't know it yet. But that was exactly what was about to happen. And it would hurt more than I ever imagined. The first thing I sold was my wedding ring. I wish I could tell you I made the decision quickly. That I was practical. Strong. Rational. The truth is, I spent almost 2 days staring at that ring before I could bring myself to do it. Most of the time, it sat on the kitchen table beside my notebook of bills. A small circle of gold. Nothing more. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But every time I looked at it, I didn't see gold. I saw memories. I saw the day Ethan slipped it onto my finger. I saw our wedding photos. I saw our first apartment. The first house we bought. The first positive pregnancy test. The life I thought we were building together. The life that no longer existed. Part of me wanted to throw the ring into a river. Part of me wanted to mail it back to Ethan. Part of me wanted to keep it forever. In the end, reality made the decision for me. Reality usually does. The mortgage company wasn't interested in memories. The electric company didn't accept sentiment. And Noah couldn't eat promises. So I took the ring to a jewelry buyer. The man behind the counter barely looked at me. To him, it was just another ring. Another transaction. Another Tuesday. He examined it for less than a minute. Then gave me a number. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was insulting. Years of marriage. Years of memories. Reduced to a number that wouldn't even cover a month's mortgage payment. For a moment, I considered walking away. Then I thought about Noah. And I signed the paperwork. When I stepped back into the parking lot, my finger felt strangely light. I kept touching the place where the ring used to be. Like my hand was searching for something that wasn't there anymore. That night, I cried harder than I had since Ethan left. Not because I missed him. Because selling the ring felt like burying the last piece of the future I had imagined. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Not even close. A few days later, I sold the television. Then the sound system. Then the spare furniture in the guest room. Then a collection of old electronics Ethan had left behind. Every sale bought me a little more time. A week here. A few days there. Nothing permanent. Just survival. The hardest part wasn't losing the objects. It was what each object represented. The television where we watched movies together. The dining table where we celebrated birthdays. The furniture we spent months saving for. Every item felt connected to a memory. And every memory felt poisoned. One afternoon, a stranger came to buy a bookshelf. As he carried it out the front door, I stood there holding Noah, watching another piece of my life disappear. When the truck drove away, the living room looked emptier. The house looked different. Smaller. Sadder. Like it was slowly being dismantled. Just like my life. By the end of that month, several rooms looked almost abandoned. Anyone walking through the house could have seen it. The signs of someone struggling to stay afloat. The signs of someone losing ground. And despite everything I sold, despite every sacrifice, despite every painful decision, the numbers still didn't work. The bills kept coming. The debt kept growing. The pressure kept building. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with all my paperwork spread out in front of me. Bank statements, medical bills, mortgage notices, utility bills. I added everything together. Then checked the total again. And again. Hoping I had made a mistake. I hadn't. The money from selling my belongings had barely made a dent. For the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had been avoiding for weeks. What if I still lose the house? What if none of this is enough? I looked around the kitchen. At all the empty spaces where things used to be. And I realized something. I wasn't selling possessions anymore. I was selling pieces of the life I used to have. And somehow, even that wasn't enough to save me. At the time, I thought that was the lowest point. I thought nothing could hurt more than watching your life disappear one item at a time. I was wrong. Because a few days later, Noah got sick. Part 5c, Noah got sick. At first, I thought it was nothing. A newborn sneezes. A newborn cries. A newborn sleeps more than usual. Every parenting book says not to panic. So I tried not to. But something felt wrong. One afternoon, while changing Noah's diaper, I noticed how warm he felt. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. I checked again. Then again. The warmth was still there. A knot formed in my stomach. I grabbed the thermometer. The number appeared on the screen. Too high. Much too high. My heart immediately started racing. I checked it again. Same result. For a few seconds, I just stared. Frozen. Trying to convince myself there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. I called the pediatrician's office. The nurse asked several questions. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Given his age, we want you to bring him in immediately. Immediately. Not tomorrow. Not later. Immediately. Within minutes, I was packing a diaper bag. My hands were shaking so badly I kept dropping things. Extra clothes. Formula. Blankets. Bottles. I couldn't think clearly. All I could focus on was Noah. He looked so small. So fragile. And for the first time since becoming a mother, I felt truly helpless. The drive to the hospital was one of the longest drives of my life. Every red light felt personal. Every minute felt stolen. I kept looking back at him in the rearview mirror. Watching his tiny chest rise and fall. Praying. Begging. Promising God things I had no power to promise. Just let him be okay. Please. Just let him be okay. When we arrived, everything happened quickly. Nurses. Doctors. Questions. Tests. Paperwork. The hospital was familiar to me. I had worked in one for years. I knew the routines. The procedures. The language. And somehow that made it worse. Because I understood exactly why everyone was moving so fast. I understood exactly why they were concerned. One of the doctors gently explained that newborn fevers are taken very seriously. They needed to run tests. They needed to monitor him. They needed to make sure nothing dangerous was developing. I nodded. Answered questions. Signed forms. did everything they asked. But inside, I was terrified. Hours passed. I barely ate. Barely drank. Barely moved. I just sat beside Noah's bed watching him sleep. Every time a monitor beeped, my heart jumped. Every time a nurse entered the room, I stopped breathing. Waiting. Hoping. Fearing. At some point during the night, I realized something. I was completely alone. There was no husband sitting beside me. No partner helping me carry the fear. No one telling me everything would be okay. Just me. And my son. The same son Ethan hadn't even bothered to meet. That realization hurt almost as much as the fear itself. Because Noah deserved better. He deserved a father who showed up. A father who cared. A father who would have been sitting right beside me that night. Instead, it was just us. Again. Near midnight, one of the nurses came in with an update. The news was encouraging. They believed they had identified the problem. They wanted to keep Noah for observation. But they expected him to recover. For the first time all day, I felt my shoulders relax. Just a little. Not completely. But enough to breathe. Enough to realize how exhausted I was. The adrenaline that had carried me through the day was finally fading. And what remained was pure exhaustion. Physical. Mental. Emotional. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. Around 1 in the morning, I stepped outside the room for a few minutes. I needed air. I needed silence. I needed a moment to gather myself. I walked through the nearly empty hospital corridors. Then out to the parking lot. The night was cold. The world felt strangely quiet. I sat in my car and closed the door. For the first time all day, nobody needed anything from me. No doctors. No nurses. No paperwork. No bills. No decisions. Just silence. I leaned back in the driver's seat. Closed my eyes. And tried not to fall apart. I didn't know it then. But in a few minutes, I was about to see the number that would become the lowest point of my entire life. The number that finally forced me to accept just how close I was to losing everything. Part 5D, $12. I sat in my car for a long time that night. At least it felt like a long time. The hospital parking lot was almost empty. A few scattered vehicles sat under the pale glow of the streetlights. The air outside was cold. The air inside the car wasn't much warmer. But I didn't turn the engine on. I didn't have the energy. For the first time all day, there was silence. No crying. No monitors. No doctors. No paperwork. Just me. And the weight of everything that had happened. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. Noah was upstairs in a hospital bed. My husband had abandoned us. My job was gone. The house was slipping away. And I was so tired I could barely think. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally picked up my phone. Maybe a few minutes. Maybe longer. At that point, time felt meaningless. I remember thinking about the next day. The next week. The next month. Every thought led back to the same question. How am I going to do this? I needed gas. I needed groceries. I needed diapers. Formula. Medicine. Mortgage payments. Utilities. Every direction I looked, there was another bill waiting. Another problem waiting. Another expense I couldn't avoid. Without really thinking, I opened my banking app. Maybe I was hoping for a miracle. Maybe I just wanted to know exactly how bad things were. The screen loaded. I stared at it. Then blinked. Then stared again. For a moment, I genuinely thought there had been some kind of error. The balance looked wrong. Impossible. I refreshed the screen. The number didn't change. I refreshed it again. Still the same. $12.43. That was it. $12.43. That was everything I had left. Everything. I remember looking around the empty parking lot as if someone might explain it to me. As if a stranger would suddenly knock on my window and tell me there had been a mistake. But there was no mistake. The money was gone. The savings were gone. The emergency fund was gone. The future I thought I had was gone. And now all that remained was $12.43. I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes the truth becomes so overwhelming that your mind doesn't know how else to react. I laughed once. Then I started crying. Really crying. The kind of crying you try to suppress for weeks. The kind that finally breaks through when there's nothing left holding it back. I cried for my marriage. I cried for my son. I cried for the woman I used to be. The woman who believed she was building a stable life. The woman who believed her husband loved her. The woman who thought she was bringing a baby into a safe home. She was gone now. And sitting in that car, I felt completely defeated. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the worst. What if I lose the house? What if I can't find another job? What if Noah gets sick again? What if I can't provide for him? What if I fail? That last question hurt the most. Because I wasn't afraid for myself. I was afraid for him. I looked at the hospital entrance. Somewhere inside that building, my son was sleeping. Completely unaware of any of this. He didn't know his father had abandoned him. He didn't know we were drowning financially. He didn't know his mother was sitting in a parking lot wondering how she was going to survive. He was innocent. And somehow that made everything hurt more. I wiped my eyes. Took a deep breath. Then another. And another. Eventually the crying stopped. Not because I felt better. Because I was exhausted. There was simply nothing left. I sat there staring at the balance one last time. $12.43. Years later, I would forget many things about that period of my life. Phone numbers. Dates. Conversations. But I never forgot that number. Because that was the moment I hit bottom. Not when Ethan left. Not when I lost my job. Not when the money disappeared. This was the moment. Sitting alone in a hospital parking lot. With a sick newborn upstairs. And $12 in my account. That was the night I lost everything. What I didn't know then was that losing everything was also the moment my life began to change. Because a few days later, someone would say something that made me question everything Ethan had done. And for the first time since he left, I would discover a reason not to give up. A few days later, Noah was finally discharged. The fever was gone. His color had returned. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept for more than 2 hours without waking up in panic. Not much had changed. I was still unemployed. Still drowning in bills. Still one missed payment away from losing the house. But at least my son was okay. At that point, that felt like a miracle. The morning we left the hospital, I stopped at the nurse's station to thank everyone. As a nurse myself, I knew how often healthcare workers never hear the end of the story. Most patients simply disappear. You never know what happened to them. Whether they got better. Whether they made it home. Whether life worked out. So I wanted to say thank you. Most of the faces were familiar. Until I saw one woman staring at me. She looked to be in her 60s. Silver hair. Kind eyes. The kind of person who immediately makes you feel safe. At first, I thought she was trying to remember where she knew me from. Then she smiled. You look just like your mother. For a moment, I froze. Very few people still recognized me because of my mother. She had passed away years earlier. And every time someone mentioned her, it caught me off guard. You knew my mom? I asked. The woman nodded. We worked together years ago. That instantly made me smile. For the first time in weeks. Not a forced smile. A real one. For the next few minutes we talked. Mostly about my mother. Old hospital stories. Funny memories. Things I hadn't thought about in years. It felt strangely comforting. Like hearing a familiar voice after being lost for a long time. Eventually, the conversation shifted. She asked how Noah was doing. Then how I was doing. I almost lied. I almost said everything was fine. But I was too tired. Too exhausted to pretend anymore. So I told her the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. My husband had left. I had lost my job. Money was tight. Things were difficult. Her expression softened immediately. I heard about your husband, she said quietly. That caught my attention. What do you mean? She hesitated. Just for a second. Then shrugged. Only a little. I felt my stomach tighten. The same feeling I had experienced so many times since Ethan left. The feeling that everyone knew something I didn't. Before I could ask another question, she said something that completely changed my day. Something that sounded so casual. So ordinary. Yet would end up changing everything. I always thought that house was yours. I blinked. What? The house? She looked genuinely confused. I thought it was in your name. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I laughed awkwardly. No. Ethan handled all that stuff. She frowned. The way people do when a puzzle piece doesn't fit. That's strange. My heartbeat suddenly quickened. What is? She thought for a moment. Then said. A few months ago, your husband came by with some paperwork. The smile disappeared from my face. What paperwork? I don't remember exactly. She looked embarrassed. It was some kind of property document. Property. The word immediately grabbed my attention. I felt my chest tighten. Property. House. Documents. Words that had become impossible for me to ignore. Seeing my expression, she quickly added. It was probably nothing. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What do you remember? I asked. The woman shook her head. Not much. Then she paused. Just that he needed a witness signature for something. A witness signature. My mind immediately started racing. Why would Ethan need a witness? Why hadn't he mentioned it? Why did this happen months ago? And most importantly, why was I only hearing about it now? The woman clearly realized she had upset me. I'm sorry, she said gently. I probably shouldn't have brought it up. I forced a smile. No. It's okay. But it wasn't okay. Not even close. Because all the way home, I couldn't stop replaying that conversation. Over and over. A witness signature. Property paperwork. Months ago. Before Noah was born. Before the divorce. Before everything fell apart. For the first time since Ethan left, a new thought entered my mind. What if this wasn't just a husband walking away from his marriage? What if there was more? That night, after Noah fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The same table where I had cried over bills. The same table where I had stared at that balance of $12.43. But this time, I wasn't looking at bank statements. I was looking at old files. Mortgage documents. Insurance records. Anything I could find. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Only that something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Ethan left. Not happiness. Not relief. Something smaller. But just as important. Hope. Because if Ethan had lied about one thing, maybe he had lied about much more. And if that was true, then maybe my story wasn't over yet. The next morning, nothing had changed. The bills were still there. The house was still at risk. My bank account was still nearly empty. And Ethan was still gone. That was the strange thing about hope. People imagine it arrives like a lightning bolt. Like a miracle. Like a sudden rescue. It doesn't. At least not in my experience. Hope arrived quietly. In the form of a question. A question I couldn't stop asking myself. What exactly had Ethan been doing behind my back? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in months, I had something other than fear occupying my mind. I had a reason to keep moving forward. And that's exactly what I did. Because regardless of what Ethan had done, Noah still needed me. The mortgage still needed to be paid. And food still had to be bought. So I made a decision. I stopped waiting for someone to save me. I started rebuilding. One day at a time. One problem at a time. $1 at a time. The first thing I did was find work. Not my dream job. Not even a good job. Just work. Anything that brought money into the house. A former coworker helped me pick up temporary shifts at a small clinic. The pay wasn't great. The hours were worse. But I said yes immediately. Because pride doesn't pay bills. The first shift felt brutal. My body was still recovering from childbirth. I was exhausted. Emotionally drained. And constantly worried about Noah. The entire time I was at work, I kept checking my phone. Looking for updates. Looking for problems. Looking for reasons to panic. But every shift meant groceries. Every shift meant formula. Every shift meant another day my son and I could survive. So I kept showing up. Then I started taking additional shifts. Weekends. Overnights. Holidays. Anything available. My life became a cycle. Work. Home. Feed Noah. Sleep for a few hours. Repeat. There were days when I felt like a machine. Days when I couldn't remember the last time I had done something for myself. Days when I cried in the shower because it was the only place I could be alone. But slowly, something started changing. Not my circumstances. Me. The woman who sat in that hospital parking lot staring at $12 was disappearing. Not because life became easier. Because she was becoming stronger. One difficult day at a time. I started keeping a notebook. Every dollar earned. Every dollar spent. Every bill paid. Every debt reduced. The numbers were small. Painfully small. But they were moving in the right direction. For the first time in months, I felt some control returning. Not much. Just enough. One evening, after Noah had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing my finances. The same table where I had cried. The same table where I had nearly given up. And for the first time, I noticed something. I had survived. Not comfortably. Not gracefully. But I had survived. Despite everything Ethan had done. I was still here. Noah was still here. And somehow, that realization mattered. A lot. Because survival creates confidence. And confidence creates courage. A few weeks later, I finally gathered the courage to look through the remaining financial documents in the house. Not because I was ready. Because I was tired of being afraid. At first, I was only looking for information. Mortgage records. Insurance paperwork. Bank statements. Anything useful. Anything that might help me understand the mess Ethan had left behind. Most of it seemed ordinary. Until I found something strange. A document buried inside a folder I hadn't opened in months. At first glance, it looked insignificant. Just another legal form. But one detail immediately caught my attention. My signature. Or at least something that looked like my signature. I stared at it. Then stared again. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Because I had never signed that document. Not ever. I knew it instantly. The handwriting looked close enough to fool a stranger. Maybe even a bank employee. But not me. I knew every curve of my signature. Every habit. Every little flaw. And that wasn't mine. For several minutes, I simply sat there, looking at the paper, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I turned the page and found another signature. And another. And another. Some familiar. Some not. All connected to financial transactions, property records, ownership documents. Things I barely remembered discussing. My heart started pounding. The conversation with the older nurse suddenly came rushing back. The witness signature. The property paperwork. The confusion in her voice. For the first time, the pieces started connecting. Slowly. Imperfectly. But enough to frighten me. Because one possibility was becoming impossible to ignore. What if Ethan hadn't simply left? What if he had been preparing to leave for months? And if that was true, what else had he done? That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was scared anymore. Because I was angry. For months, I had blamed myself. Questioned myself. Wondered what I had done wrong. But sitting there with those documents spread across the table, I began to realize something. Maybe this wasn't a marriage that had fallen apart. Maybe it was something far more deliberate. And for the first time since Ethan abandoned us, I stopped thinking about survival. I started thinking about the truth. For weeks, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. A misunderstanding. A paperwork error. Anything. Because the alternative was much harder to accept. The alternative was that my husband had planned all of this. And if that was true, then the man I married had never really been the man I thought he was. The next morning, after dropping Noah off with a neighbor who occasionally helped me during work shifts, I drove to the county records office. I told myself I was only looking for answers. Nothing more. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't building a case. I simply wanted to understand what had happened to my life. The woman behind the counter helped me request copies of several property records. Most of the paperwork meant very little to me. Legal descriptions. Parcel numbers. Technical language. Pages and pages of information. Then I found it. A document filed for months before Noah was born. My name appeared on it. My signature appeared on it. At least, something pretending to be my signature. I felt my stomach drop. Because this wasn't a suspicion anymore. This was proof. Someone had signed my name. And that someone wasn't me. I requested additional records. Then more. Then more. By the time I left the building, I was carrying a stack of documents thick enough to fill a binder. That night, after Noah fell asleep, I spread everything across the kitchen table. Page after page. Document after document. Date after date. And a pattern began to emerge. Every major transaction happened while I was pregnant. Every major decision happened while I was focused on preparing for Noah. Every major change happened while I trusted Ethan completely. I sat there until almost 2 in the morning. Cross-referencing dates. Reading signatures. Comparing records. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. One transfer had occurred on the exact day Ethan accompanied me to an ultrasound appointment. I remembered that day clearly. He had held my hand. Smiled when we heard Noah's heartbeat. Taken me out for lunch afterward. I remembered feeling loved. Protected. Safe. Meanwhile, sometime that same day, he had been moving assets behind my back. I pushed the papers away and covered my face. For a few minutes, I couldn't even look at them. Not because of the money. Because of the betrayal. The lies. The performance. How many times had he kissed me goodbye before meeting a lawyer? How many times had he asked about the baby while planning his exit? How many times had he looked me in the eye and lied? The questions wouldn't stop. And the answers only got worse. A few days later, I met with an attorney. Not because I was ready to sue anyone. Because I needed someone to tell me whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. The attorney reviewed the documents carefully. Then reviewed them again. His expression changed with every page. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. This wasn't done overnight. I remember those exact words. This took planning. Planning. The word echoed inside my head. Because that's what I had been afraid of. A mistake would have been easier. A moment of weakness would have been easier. Even an affair would have been easier. But planning? Planning meant intention. Planning meant choice. Planning meant Ethan had spent months preparing to destroy our marriage. The attorney pointed to several transactions. Several ownership changes. Several documents that should have required my direct involvement. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Then another name started appearing. Over and over again. Claire Whitman. Ethan's boss. The same woman whose name I had heard constantly during my pregnancy. The same woman responsible for all those late nights. All those missed dinners. All those urgent meetings. At first, I wanted to believe it was a coincidence. It wasn't. Her name was everywhere. Emails. Authorizations. Communications. Approvals. She wasn't standing on the sidelines. She was involved. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. For months, I had imagined Claire as the woman Ethan left me for. That alone had been painful enough. But this was different. Much worse. Because now it appeared she hadn't simply benefited from what happened. She had helped make it happen. I drove home that day feeling numb. The steering wheel felt heavy. My thoughts felt heavier. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes. Staring at the house. The same house I had nearly lost. The same house I was still fighting to keep. And for the first time since Ethan left, everything became crystal clear. This wasn't a marriage that slowly fell apart. This wasn't a husband who made a terrible mistake. This wasn't an affair that got out of control. This was a plan. A carefully constructed plan. And I had been the target. I walked inside. Picked Noah up from his crib. And held him close. For a long time, neither of us moved. Then I whispered something I didn't fully understand until years later. I'm done being afraid. Because something had changed. For months, I had been trying to survive. Now I wanted the truth. And once I had the truth, I wanted justice. For a long time, I thought justice would feel dramatic. Like something out of a movie. A confrontation. A confession. A moment where the villain finally admits what they've done. Real life doesn't work that way. Justice begins with paperwork. And patience. A lot of patience. After meeting with the attorney, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Ethan walk away from what he had done. Not because I wanted revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. I wanted accountability. I wanted answers. And most of all, I wanted my son to grow up knowing that people couldn't destroy your life without consequences. The first few weeks were frustrating. Every answer created 3 new questions. Every document led to another document. Every lead required more work. More records. More requests. More waiting. Some nights I worked a clinic shift until midnight. Then came home and spent another 3 hours organizing paperwork. The dining table disappeared beneath folders and binders. Bank statements. Property records. Insurance documents. Email printouts. Phone records. It looked less like a home and more like a war room. I remember one night looking around the kitchen and laughing. Months earlier, I couldn't afford groceries. Now I was building a legal case. Life is strange sometimes. The attorney and I slowly began connecting pieces together. Not assumptions. Evidence. Real evidence. One transfer connected to another. One document explained another. One lie exposed three more. The deeper we looked, the clearer the picture became. Ethan hadn't simply moved money. He had hidden it. He hadn't simply left. He had prepared to leave. And he hadn't acted alone. Claire's involvement became impossible to ignore. At first, her name appeared occasionally. Then constantly. Emails. Authorizations. Internal communications. The pattern was obvious. The affair wasn't separate from the financial deception. The two had been happening side by side. For months. I should have felt shocked. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Maybe because by then, I had already lived through the worst part. Nothing on paper could hurt more than sitting in a hospital parking lot with $12. Nothing. One afternoon, my attorney called with news. Real news. The kind of news that changes everything. Several of the signatures had been reviewed. Questions were being raised. Official questions. Serious questions. The kind that couldn't be ignored. I remember sitting down immediately. My knees literally felt weak. For months, I had been carrying this burden alone. People sympathized. People felt sorry for me. But sympathy isn't proof. Now we had proof. And proof changes everything. Not long after that, requests for additional records were filed. Then subpoenas. Then formal inquiries. Suddenly, people who had been comfortable staying silent started paying attention. Because evidence has a way of making silence uncomfortable. The first sign that Ethan knew something was wrong came unexpectedly. He called me. The first real call in months. I stared at the screen before answering. His name looked strange. Like it belonged to someone I used to know. When I finally picked up, there was no apology. No concern for Noah. No acknowledgement of what he had done. Instead, he asked a question. A very specific question. Why are people asking about old records? I almost smiled. Because for the first time since he left, Ethan sounded nervous. Not angry. Not confident. Nervous. I gave him a simple answer. The truth has a way of finding people. Then I hung up. It wasn't dramatic. But it felt good. Really good. After that, things started moving faster. More records surfaced. More inconsistencies appeared. More people became involved. The story Ethan had built for months began developing cracks. Small cracks at first. Then larger ones. The kind of cracks that eventually bring entire structures down. And the most satisfying part. I didn't have to destroy anything. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to threaten anyone. I didn't have to play dirty. All I had to do was keep going. Keep collecting facts. Keep telling the truth. Keep showing up. The lies were collapsing under their own weight. One by one. Slowly. Then all at once. A few weeks before the hearing, my attorney placed a thick folder on the table. He looked at me and smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile like that. We have enough. Just 4 words. But I will never forget them. We have enough. Enough evidence. Enough documents. Enough proof. Enough truth. For months, Ethan had controlled the story. Now that story was about to belong to someone else. For the first time since my life fell apart, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because I finally understood something. The hearing wasn't the beginning of my fight. It was the end of it. The fight had happened during the sleepless nights. The double shifts. The hospital parking lot. The days I wanted to quit and didn't. The hearing would simply reveal what had already become true. Ethan thought he had taken everything from me. What he never realized was that surviving him had made me stronger than he ever expected. And very soon, everyone else was about to find out too. The hearing took place almost 18 months after Noah was born. 18 months. That's how long it took to get from a hospital parking lot with $12 to a courtroom full of evidence. Looking back, that timeline matters. Because people often imagine justice arrives quickly. It doesn't. Justice is slow. Painfully slow. But eventually, if you refuse to quit, it arrives. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I was nervous. Because I couldn't sleep. For months, I had imagined this day. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I wanted the truth to finally exist somewhere outside my own head. I wanted someone else to see what I had seen. To understand what had happened. To understand what Ethan had done. Noah was staying with my sister. By then she had returned home, and become one of the few people I truly trusted. Before leaving, I stood in Noah's room for a moment. Watching him sleep. His tiny baby bed had been replaced by a toddler bed. His face looked different now. Older. Healthier. Stronger. So much had changed. And yet everything I was doing that day was still for him. I kissed his forehead. Then left. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Less dramatic. Less impressive. No giant speeches. No television moments. Just lawyers. Documents. Witnesses. And facts. Lots of facts. When Ethan walked into the room, I almost didn't recognize him. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence was gone. The man who once disappeared without explanation. The man who thought he could control everything. The man who believed I would never fight back. He looked tired. Worried. Smaller somehow. For a brief second, our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The hearing began. At first, everything felt painfully technical. Dates. Records. Transactions. Property documents. Financial statements. The language was dry. Boring even. But beneath every document was a story. My story. The story of what had been taken. One piece at a time. The first major turning point came when the question signatures were discussed. I remember Ethan's attorney trying to minimize their importance. Trying to explain them away. Trying to create doubt. Then the expert testimony began. And the room changed. Because facts don't care about excuses. Several signatures were determined to be inconsistent. Several documents raised serious concerns. Several transactions suddenly became impossible to ignore. For the first time all day, I saw Ethan stop taking notes. His attorney leaned toward him. Whispered something. Neither of them looked happy. Hours later, the financial records were presented. Transfer after transfer. Document after document. Timeline after timeline. Everything lined up. The planning. The preparation. The hidden transactions. The movement of assets. The months of deception. Watching it unfold felt surreal. Because I had lived through those months. I remembered every doctor's appointment. Every baby purchase. Every nursery conversation. And now the truth sat on a screen for everyone to see. While I was preparing for Noah's birth, Ethan was preparing his exit. The contrast was devastating. Then came Claire. For months she had existed like a shadow over the entire story. Now her role was being examined publicly. Emails were reviewed. Communications were discussed. Timelines were compared. Nobody needed dramatic confessions. The records spoke for themselves. And they were speaking very loudly. At one point, I looked across the room and saw Claire staring down at the table. She never looked at me. Not once. I found that strangely satisfying. Not because I hated her. Because for the first time, she couldn't hide behind closed doors. Neither of them could. The truth was finally bigger than their lies. By late afternoon, the momentum had completely shifted. You could feel it. Even without legal training. even without understanding every procedural detail. The room felt different. The confidence Ethan arrived with had vanished. His explanations grew weaker. His answers grew shorter. The certainty was gone. And in its place was something else. Consequences. Real consequences. When the hearing finally ended, the ruling didn't come immediately. We had to wait. Another painful wait. Another stretch of uncertainty. But this time felt different. Because for the first time, I wasn't waiting in fear. I was waiting with hope. Several weeks later, the decision arrived. I still remember opening the envelope. My hands shaking. My heart racing. Certain moments stay with you forever. This was one of them. The ruling addressed the transactions. The property issues. The financial misconduct. Piece by piece. Page by page. And with every paragraph, I felt years of weight lifting from my shoulders. Not because everything was being fixed. Some things can never be fixed. The missed birth. The betrayal. The sleepless nights. The fear. Those things don't disappear. But accountability matters. Truth matters. Consequences matter. Several assets were ordered to be restored. Several transactions were overturned. Additional investigations were recommended. And most importantly, the official record finally reflected the truth. Not Ethan's version. The truth. When I reached the final page, I set the document down and cried. Not because I had won. Because I was finally free. Free from questioning myself. Free from wondering if I had imagined everything. Free from carrying the burden alone. The fight was over. The truth had survived. And for the first time since Noah was born, I felt peace. Real peace. The kind that cannot be purchased. The kind that can only be earned. All because I refused to give up when I had every reason to. A year later, life looked very different. Not perfect. Just different. And honestly, that was enough. The house was still standing. The bills were paid. Not all at once. Not magically. Just one payment at a time. 1 month at a time. One step at a time. The way real life works. Noah had grown so much that sometimes it felt impossible to believe he was the same tiny baby I once held in a hospital room. The same baby whose father never came to meet him. The same baby who slept beside me while I wondered if we were going to lose everything. Now he ran through the house laughing. Turning every room into a playground. Leaving toys everywhere. Making messes faster than I could clean them. And somehow, I loved every second of it. One morning, I stood in the kitchen making breakfast while Noah sat at the table coloring. Sunlight came through the window. The same window I had stared out of during some of the darkest days of my life. For a moment, I simply watched him. The concentration on his face. The way he held his crayons. The way he smiled whenever he was proud of something. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of moments people rarely appreciate until they've almost lost them. I used to think success meant money. A bigger house. A better car. A perfect life. Now I knew better. Success was peace. Success was safety. Success was knowing my son would never have to wonder whether his mother would fight for him. Because I always would. Sometimes people ask if I hate Ethan. The answer surprises them. I don't. Not anymore. Hate requires energy. And I spent enough energy surviving. The truth is, Ethan stopped being the center of my story a long time ago. At first, I thought this story was about a man who betrayed me. Then I thought it was about losing everything. Then I thought it was about justice. I was wrong. This story was never about Ethan. It was about Noah. And it was about me. It was about discovering what remained after everything else was taken away. It was about finding strength I never knew existed. The woman who sat in that hospital parking lot with $12.43 in her bank account believed her life was over. She was wrong too. That wasn't the end. That was the beginning. A few weeks ago, Noah started preschool. On his first day, he grabbed my hand as we walked toward the building. He was nervous. I was too. When we reached the door, he looked up at me and smiled. Then he ran inside without looking back. I stood there watching him go. Watching this little boy who had survived every storm with me. And suddenly I remembered the hospital. The empty closet. The missing money. The unpaid bills. The sleepless nights. The fear. All of it. For years, I thought those memories would always hurt. But standing there that morning, they felt different. Not painful. Just distant. Like a storm that had finally passed. I smiled. Turned around. And walked back to my car. Not as a victim. Not as a woman someone abandoned. Not as someone who lost everything. But as a mother who refused to give up. They tried to take everything from me. My marriage. My savings. My future. They failed. Because in the end, I still had the one thing that mattered most. My son. And together we made it. The end.